Karl Marx. Karl Marx debated these Philistines in a very active way. But now if we move from him, it's sort of jumping around because history is not in a straight line here, to the early 1900s and the Bolsheviki in what would later be the Soviet Union. There was a tremendous fight there against various gangs, right-wing gangs that were sent in by the powers, the U.S., the British, etc. There were monarchists there, and various other characters there also. And then you had people like Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman, of course, was an anarchist in the American tradition. Of course, she was expelled. But one of the problems there was that you then had a revolution to establish socialism in effectively a peasant state. Thus, when the Bolsheviki came to power under V.I. Lenin, they really had to make, as they say, some real-world choices. They did not have the luxury of being armchair-type classic liberals or American anarchists or whatever. As the General Patton said, the time for this individualism crap was over, and it literally was. They had to move on with building their nation, and not only building of the nation, but also at the same time, they had to consolidate power very, very quickly to fight all the enemies of the revolution. So that was a problem within itself. But if you really want to look at this debate, you'll go to Karl Marx and Bakunin at the Mikhail Bakunin at the First International. These debates went on and on. But the point was made after the First International, and then, of course, in the U.S. there were two different communist parties, and the International wanted the question to be settled. And if you watch the theatrical presentation Reds, there's a little bit you can get there, because Americans like to go to the cinema to get their history, and perhaps hoping at the same time it's not ahistorical. But some of it was back to the left in America as being literary types. Yes, a lot of the leftists were writers with very little political experience. Now, there was one writer out of Portland, Oregon, that did have some political instincts, a bona fide, named John Reed. He wrote The 7 Days That Shook the World. And he's buried in the Kremlin now with Lenin and the other martyrs of that revolution. So that tradition quickly came there, and after the Soviet revolution in the early 1900s, you still had these other little parties and tendencies going along up to the war. And after the Great War, they had to calm down a little bit because it was a united front against fascism. But in the U.S., during the Cold War, that's when these other characters all came out. Various little tendencies, some calling themselves socialists, some calling themselves who knows what. The Abbie Hoffman gang, and then they were labeled by the press and themselves as quote-unquote the new left. Well, they were not the new left. They were the same old left that John Reed had to deal with. They had just gotten on TV. They didn't have social media, fortunately, for the world. But they did have TV. They were able to get on it. And some of those people came out of the civil rights struggle, because the civil rights struggle was really the only time that they had an opportunity to organize collectively and literally to fight the powers that be. Apartheid. They were fighting apartheid when it was official in the U.S., or it would be North or be South, and it was in laws called Jim Crow. Now the Republicans and their allies and Libertarians have brought back Jim Crow through voter ID. All of this ties together. We did an episode yesterday on the apartheid in the environmental movement. This is a leftover. Many of the people in the environmental movement are themselves libertarians at a point. Now, the libertarians would not go along with, say, regulation of greenhouse gases, etc. In fact, they're talking about that. But you have to understand that libertarianism is commercial. Now, you have others out there that are more with the libertarians or anarchists in Europe. But they're out there. Most of them do not have political parties. They do have the Greens, but the Greens are not socialists. The Greens are social democrats, and we didn't even get into this because it's not in the Wikipedia survey here, we'll call it. But the social democrats are at best what most of these people are. An example of a social democrat of sort would be Reb Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not necessarily a socialist, he's not, but he would be some sort of social democrat. Now, in the Russian Revolution, the Social Democrats were defeated. Now, this was not necessarily Bakunin, but there were other Social Democrats running around there, too. They were literally put out of business. And after the war, the Great Patriotic War in Europe, you had your communist parties in France and Italy. They were the left, primarily. Now, you had other tendencies there, some of the socialist parties, but served only a disruptive function there, and they used that ideology to combat the Soviet Union by using quote-unquote anti-communism, and you'll hear the same old arguments, authoritarian and the like. In the U.S., Marcuse was one of these characters that came out here. In fact, he was the press professor of Angela Davis. She did her PhD under him, but she was in the Communist Party. Mr. Marcuse, or Dr. Marcuse, was not in the Communist Party. But then you have other leftover relics which are still around today, I think. They've not died out yet. But I just saw him. Well, there are others that are even more prominent than him, but we'll get Noam Chomsky, who calls himself a libertarian socialist. So in other words, he's for less government. He'll never have socialism with less government. He's on a pipe dream. But at the same time, this individual thing flocks in here. So it all ties together. In other words, it's right-wing socialism at best, plays into the hands of the Cato Institute there, because some of the same things are prevalent. That was why when the WWW, that was the industrial workers, they were fought by these anarchists, but they are still around. And the International Workers, so that's a syndicate. Anyway, we didn't have time to get into our syndicates here, but they are a little bit different. So there is political action going on, but this gets to the central point we're doing this episode. The Republicans under Rand Paul, he's a disciple of Ayn Rand. Objectivism is what she talked about, another one of these individual-centered things. She's very popular, and Paul believes that they can attract young people under the general term libertarian. Well, the whole problem there is you have, in other words, the libertarians in the American sense are fiscally conservative. They believe in less government, less paying in a tax, etc. But in the social sphere, they are liberal. In other words, the interference of the government in certain things. So this plays into popular things like, say, marriage equality, because a libertarian would not interfere there. It would say, well, that's not for the government. So that's where you really have a very interesting situation. In a nation that has a history of ideological backwardness going back to the quote-unquote left that was around when John Reed was around. So you had those problems in the 30s when the left here was trying to mature. the two communist parties, at the time it was called the Socialist Party, they formed the Communist Party USA. And thus they continued on till this day. But at the same time, you had other smaller tendencies around, primarily the Socialist Workers' Party, but you had others. And these parties were doing, Socialist Workers' Party, with their Milton forums, Malcolm X even appeared there, they were doing electoral work, as what Social Democrats would do, like, say, the Freedmen Peace Party. And various ones are more likely in California left over there. But nonetheless, focused on, we'll say, peace, anti-war, whatever. These are primarily Social Democrats. There's a blurred line between what they are and what they are not. We saw them pop up in Iowa in our coverage of the presidential primaries out there, and doing some electoral work there. But at the same time, it's sort of in and sort of out. But what happens when you have the kind of ideological misinformation going out there, and there's no clarity? It brings in opportunists. You have opportunists on the right, like Rand Paul. Opportunists on the left, like Noam Chomsky. So you have those kinds of characters out there. And in the present social media situation, one little tendency or one little group can form around 20 or 5,000 people or whatever, and get on Facebook, and away they go. Where they're going, who honestly knows? But nonetheless, they are going. So this allows the major parties to manipulate them, the Republican Party being a right-of-center party. And we didn't go back to some of the people that took this so-called classical liberalism, they would say, of Burke, Edmund Burke, would be like Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater believed, say, in freedom of religion. He was a secular person, but the Republican Party decided that they would not be secular. They would drop that, and they would be anti-government on so-called fiscal issues. And because of their base, they had to remain opposed to things like marriage equality, abortions, etc., because that was part of what their base was about. They inherited that base in the Southern Strategy, basically a bunch of racist types, and then they, along the way, somewhere got these patriot groups that Sarah Palin brought in that were not already in. They have a very similar philosophy, anti-tax, anti-Fed, out there. So all these things sort of came together in Don't Tread on Me, unless I need a bailout. Now they got too big to fail. But you got to remember, Michelle Bachmann's a good, and she's on incidentally investigation, a little hanky-panky. But she's been a criminal and gangster for a long time. But the whole point there is that these characters will say no government bailouts, no pork out there. But when it comes to her district, she's ranting and raving about the closure of some airport towers because of sequester. Well, the money is just not there, so they have to make some of these closings. So in other words, there's the way that this so-called libertarianism of Bachmann works, and then there's the practical side of it. She's waiting on an earmark and get as much federal money as she can. And the same thing with the corporations. If you recall, they literally lined up, like we do in the military, and they did a standard formation. Now, these were the chief executives of Microsoft, IBM. They were all there, and GM. They were all in nice black suits. And President Obama was standing there with a sheet of paper. That was the divvy-up box, basically. They all got the money and went home and were happy ever after, and were able to give millions of dollars to Will Romney. So William Romney is now